So for the Q&A, we have a few questions have already been answered directly. There is one question for Ninan, which is asking about the impact for the port of PSA in Singapore. Ninan, do you want to take this and answer this one?
Yeah, precisely. I mean, I did not answer it online because there are many experts in this panel who could take a stab at this question. But what I saw strangely was that if you look at the port performance of Singapore for June, their volumes dropped only 3%, while the number of vessel calls dropped by 40%. So what does that speak? I mean, as I look at it, in my years of operating feeder ships based in Singapore, there is a lot of transshipment happening, even though the vessel calls have reduced substantially by 40%. So I would like to throw the question back to the panelists. I think Jonathan, very, very expert in this area. I would like to hear your views because this is exactly what the governments would be asking us, the bank. And over to you, the panelists. Anyone want to take it?
Jonathan, do you want to?
I don't think I can add much more to Bijou, particularly the detail about the vessel calls is very interesting. But certainly the volume drop had attracted my attention because I was expecting to see much higher Bijou relative to what you're seeing around the region, and also relative to what we've been seeing coming in and out of China. But I don't think I can offer much more insight than that.
I think, again, this brings back to one of the slides I put in on the trends. You have a growing middle class who will continue to consume. And the digitalization is going to enable transportation of finished and consumer goods all around the region, especially in intra-Asia region, where these rising middle class with the purchasing power is coming up. So I agree, that the volumes forecast is a little bit pessimistic. I'm a more optimistic in the volumes coming back. Of course, the vessel calls have dropped because of the blank sailings. So you will see probably a few vessels bringing in as much loads as it should be. These are my thoughts. Thank you.
Okay, then there was one question that's been answered already, but I'd just like to put that to the rest of the panel. It was answered by Gagan and Anthony. A question was, what are your views on the investment potential of ports specifically in sub-Saharan Africa? Jonathan or Johannes, or maybe you, Bijou, from the financing perspective, what are your views specifically on that region? Do you want to? Anyone wants to say something about that? Or
I can start.
Yeah.
I will see. I mean, we look at increasing activity by the private sector in ports, especially in Africa. Take an example of Timor-Leste. Their volumes are 100,000, 120,000 TEUs, but they were able to get a private terminal operator to commit to an investment of $360 million going forward, right? Now, these kinds of examples are out there in the market. There are opportunities, new markets emerging, productions shift and trade is shifting. So we look at a very positive scenario, especially for private terminal operators.
Thank you.
Just Nishal, I was just going to again echo, I think, of course, there's still many growth opportunities there. Without straying into too many politics, I think the challenge is where there's been port development projects that have been led by an EPC party, backed by sovereign loans, so there hasn't been the same project due diligence, and you've got an entity driving it that doesn't have a long-term interest in the performance of the asset. That's not unique to any port development. We see those challenges in other areas, but I think it's been particularly a challenge in some of the port developments we've seen in Africa.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you to the panel. There is one question from Ranjit Powell, and he's asking, I'm interested in what M&A the panel is seeing in soft infrastructure as opposed to hard assets such as port and terminals. What deals do you see going through in this space? Maybe a question maybe for Anthony or Johannes or anyone else who wants to say something on that.
Maybe from our end, we tend to focus on the hard assets such as port and terminals ourselves. We have less focus on soft assets. Soft, I assume, being anything that relates to either IT development, not directly related to significant infra investments, etc., port community systems, and the likes. So maybe to answer this particular question on our end, it's not our focus. We focus really on the hard assets such as port and terminals.
I think soft indeed is probably the more sort of digitalization related asset. So maybe Johannes, maybe you don't want to say something.
Yeah, I mean, we as a company, we see quite a bit of interest on these types of assets as well, especially from a PE side. So there are quite a few PE players, especially in the US, that have a focus on the digital space, and especially there we've seen quite a bit of activity recently, and interest also to buy, digital players that serve terminal operators, specifically, for example, providers of terminal operating systems. So I think there is activity, there is interest. I see it especially coming from private equity players.
Thank you. I have a question as well, actually, for you, Johannes. For digitalization, I think when we talk about that, especially related to blockchain and some of these new technology, what I hear quite a lot is a big challenge there is the trust that people have. People don't really trust different parties with confidential information, especially when it comes to sharing documents for transactions. I think it's more of a perception, the security issue, but then you have, the big hack of Maersk a couple of years ago that probably stays in people's mind. But what do you think can be done to then overcome some of these challenges and maybe give comfort to people in the industry?
That's a tough question, Michel. If I had the answer, I would start a company right away and solve some of these issues. It is a major inhibitor, as I said, right? I mean, there is a lack of willingness to share data. I mean, the example that I mentioned in my presentation is the thing that comes most to mind for me is sharing of containers in order to avoid empty moves. And in order to enable that, players and especially container shipping companies are quite reluctant in revealing confidential ultimately, but client information, which you need to some extent to make it happen. So I think one of the solutions has to be kind of independent matching platforms ultimately. I mean, maybe that's one possible solution, one possible way of solving this, where you have matchmakers that basically work in the background that try to find solutions to bridge that gap. Where basically both sides maybe to some extent then don't see the information that is being shared, while the match that has to happen basically in order to enable these efficiencies is still made similar to kind of like a clearinghouse approach. But it's a difficult question, and ultimately whoever cracks it, as I mentioned in my presentation, will probably be able to be quite successful in the marketplace.
Yeah. I see we're reaching the end of our time, so maybe I will just put one last question, maybe, which is more a general question for everyone. For example, Gagan from the investor's perspective, or Bijou from a financing perspective, or others from the more transactional. do you see from now the COVID pandemic, do you see an impact on what you consider as potential investment, what you would consider as potential investment last year? And do you see a bit of a trend in that changing in terms of maybe the size of the assets that you consider, or in terms of geographical location, or the type of customers, type of assets? Do you see that maybe it's a bit early to ask this question, it might change over the long term, but what's your general view on that, on how this could be impacted?
I'll perhaps take a shot at it. Great question, Nisha. Perhaps by using two specific examples. One of them is a small sub-Saharan African country where we had an eye on a particular port operation since a while. And we noticed that the authorities were quite keen to keep it with themselves and not partner with the private sector for that. However, as the times changed, the ability of the particular government to continue investing in their port infrastructure and operations all by themselves has diminished, and especially when, for instance, and Biju will subscribe to this, when, for instance, institutions such as IMF get involved in the fiscal management of a certain country, then there are strict limits to what you can do with debt, as an example. So, we have seen a shift in the mood of the particular authority here in now being more able, more open to partnering with the private sector for investing in the infrastructure. So that's sort of one example on the government side. And on the more private side, as an example, again, we had identified certain particular terminal assets where we would, where we saw a good fit and we would have been interested in. Earlier conversations with owners resulted in, conversations around, at least from a buyer's point of view, what we saw as unreasonable valuation expectations and so on, or perhaps not being serious enough to discuss a real transaction. And I think some of these are now coming to the table actively with perhaps an openness to, more reasonableness around the valuation discussion. So those are some of the changes that we are starting to see, but still early days.
Yeah, that's very interesting. As anyone else wants to share their views on this?
Same sentiments. I know the volumes have taken a hit, so the operators are cautious. So you might see more discussions, and as Gagan was mentioning, a more reasonableness would come into the discussions, reasonable valuations, and definitely opportunities for private sector. And you have some fantastic consultants in this panel. They are the ones everybody should go to.
Thank you. Okay, so on that note, I think I will now hand back to AJ for the final remark and closing the session. You will receive all representation later from Transport Event. AJ?
Thank you, Nishal. A special thank you to our moderator, Nishal, for his time in joining us today to moderate today's webinar. Once again, we would like to thank Red Sea Gateway Terminal for sponsoring this webinar. Gagan, thank you very much indeed to you and your team. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank our panelists, Gagan, Dr. Jonathan, Anthony, Dr. Johannes, Ninan, and Sabimir for their time and in preparing their insightful presentations for this webinar. The presentations given today and a recording of this webinar will be available to all registered attendees tomorrow at www.transportevents.com. Thank you to all our viewers for your attendance. We hope this webinar has been valuable and informative and helps you develop new business from what you have learned here today. May I ask everyone to follow us at Transport Events on LinkedIn and visit our website www.transportevents.com for latest information on our market-leading annual events and webinars. You may contact me directly at ajay@transportevents.com for any further assistance, spelled AJAY at transportevents.com. May I also invite you to email me if you would like to have your own company's latest full color logo and company details exclusively branded before, during, and after our next webinar taking place on Thursday, 23rd July. May I wish our valued moderator, our wonderful speakers, and our viewers everywhere in the world a goodbye for now, and see you again on Thursday, 23rd July. Thank you.